Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I joined a seminar on the deep web that teach me how to communicate with extraterrestrial life. So, I never thought I'd end up here, sharing this on Reddit, but after everything that happened, I need to get this off my chest. A few months ago, I stumbled across a seminar on the deep web. Yeah, I know how it sounds, but I was deep into conspiracy theories and late-night YouTube rabbit holes, and I guess curiosity got the better of me. It all started when I was browsing some dark web forums out of boredom. Most of the stuff was the usual junk: drugs, weapons, fake IDs. But then, a post caught my eye. Join our seminar on communicating with extraterrestrial life limited spots. I laughed it off at first, but something about the idea stuck with me. Maybe it was the promise of something beyond the mundane, or maybe I was just looking for an escape from my crappy day-to-day life. Either way, I clicked on it. The registration was sketchy, to say the least. They wanted Bitcoin, of course, and the price was steep, but I had some crypto saved up from a lucky investment a few years back. So I thought, why not? After all, it wasn't like I was doing anything better with my life. After sending the payment, I received an email with a link to a private chat room and instructions to join at midnight. The email warned me not to share the link or details with anyone, which only made it more intriguing. Midnight rolled around and I logged in. The chat room was already buzzing with activity. There were about 20 of us, all strangers, hiding behind usernames. The seminar started with a guy who called himself Dr. A. He had one of those robotic text-to-speech voices, which added to the overall creepiness. Dr. A started by explaining that extraterrestrial communication was possible, but it required opening one's mind in ways conventional science couldn't explain. The first few sessions were pretty tame, mostly involving meditation techniques and weird audio frequencies that we had to listen to. But then things took a dark turn. Dr. A introduced us to something he called the Gateway. It was a supposed portal to other dimensions, a place where we could make contact with alien entities. The idea was to reach a state of consciousness where our minds could transcend physical reality. To achieve this, we were given a set of rituals to perform. They were nothing like the meditation exercises from before. These rituals were disturbing, involving blood and pain. We were instructed to make small cuts on our bodies and smear the blood on symbols we had to draw on the floor. I was hesitant, but the other participants seemed to be going along with it, sharing their experiences in the chat. They described seeing strange lights and hearing whispers. I wanted to believe it was all a trick, some elaborate prank, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening. One night, after performing the ritual, I started to feel different. My room felt colder, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the corner, barely visible in the darkness. It was tall and thin, with elongated limbs and a face that was more insect than human. Its eyes were empty voids, staring right through me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The thing just stood there, watching me. The next morning, I woke up on the floor. The symbols smeared, and my blood dried on the carpet. I wanted to quit the seminar right then and there, but a part of me was hooked. I needed to know more. I needed to understand what I had seen. The sessions continued, getting more intense each time. Dr. A introduced us to new rituals, each more painful and grotesque than the last. We were instructed to drink concoctions made from unknown herbs that cause vivid hallucinations. During one session, I saw my own death over and over again in excruciating detail. I felt the pain, the fear, the cold embrace of death itself. I started losing touch with reality. I couldn't sleep, and when I did, the nightmares were unbearable. My friends and family noticed the change in me, but I couldn't tell them what was happening. Who would believe me? I became paranoid, thinking that the entities I had seen were watching me, even when I was awake. One night during a particularly brutal ritual, I felt something break inside me. It was as if a dam had burst, and my mind was flooded with images and sounds that didn't belong in this world. I saw alien landscapes, twisted and wrong, with creatures that defied description. I heard their voices, speaking in a language that was more felt than heard, and they were angry. They were angry at me for intruding into their world. I realized too late that the seminar was not about communication. It was about opening doors that were meant to stay closed. And now, those doors were open, and there was no way to shut them. So, after that night, things started spiraling out of control. The creatures I saw during the rituals began appearing more frequently, not just in the corner of my room, but everywhere I went. At first, it was subtle, shadowy figures in my peripheral vision, fleeting glimpses of distorted faces in reflective surfaces. But soon, they became more aggressive. One evening, I was in the kitchen, trying to distract myself by cooking dinner. As I chopped vegetables, I felt a chill run down my spine. When I turned around, there it was again, one of those beings standing right behind me. Its elongated fingers reached out, brushing against my shoulder. I could feel its cold, clammy touch through my shirt. I dropped the knife and stumbled back, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Desperation drove me back to the chat room. I needed answers, needed to know if anyone else was experiencing the same horrors. The others were hesitant to share at first, but as I described my encounters, they opened up. We were all seeing them, the entities, the nightmares, the hallucinations. It wasn't just me. We were all being haunted. Dr. A seemed to relish in our fear. He encouraged us to embrace the experiences, to let go of our earthly fears and accept the new reality we were uncovering. He claimed it was a necessary step to achieve true communication with the extraterrestrial beings, but it felt more like we were being tortured, slowly driven to the brink of insanity. One night, during a particularly intense session, Dr. A introduced a new ritual. This one required us to use a mirror. We had to sit in front of it, draw the symbols with our blood, and stare into our own reflections while chanting an incantation. The chant was in that strange language I had heard before, the one that felt more like a vibration in my skull than actual words. As I stared into the mirror, chanting the incantation, my reflection began to change. My eyes darkened, my skin grew pale, and my features twisted into something monstrous. It was like looking at a demonic version of myself. I wanted to stop, but I couldn't. My reflection started to move independently, grinning at me with a malicious, toothy smile. Then it reached out of the mirror. The cold hand of my reflection wrapped around my wrist, pulling me closer to the glass. I felt an intense pressure in my head, like my skull was being crushed from the inside. The room around me dissolved, displaced by a dark, endless void. I was floating, suspended in nothingness, surrounded by whispers and laughter that echoed from every direction. Suddenly, I was back in my room, gasping for air. The mirror was shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. My wrist was bleeding where my reflection had grabbed me. I was shaking, drenched in sweat, but alive. Barely. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't leave my apartment, couldn't eat or sleep. The entities were always there, watching me, whispering in that alien language. They wanted something from me, but I couldn't understand what. I felt like I was losing my mind, slipping further into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My phone rang one afternoon, startling me out of a daze. It was one of the participants from the seminar, someone I had grown close to over the past few weeks. They were frantic, their voice barely recognizable through the sobs and static. They told me they had seen one of the entities in broad daylight, following them through the streets. They were convinced it was going to kill them. I tried to calm them down, but my own fear was palpable. As we talked, I heard a strange noise on the other end of the line, a low guttural growl, followed by a blood-curdling scream. The call abruptly ended, leaving me with the deafening silence of my apartment. I tried calling back, but there was no answer. They were gone. Panic set in. I had to find a way to stop this, to close the door we had opened. I went back to the chat room, but it was empty. Dr. A had vanished, and so had most of the participants. The few that remained were incoherent, rambling about visions of other worlds and beings that defied description. They were too far gone to help. In my desperation, I started researching ways to undo what we had done. I found ancient texts and obscure rituals, each one more disturbing than the last. I spent nights poring over them, my eyes burning from lack of sleep, my mind racing with fear and anxiety. I was determined to find a way out, to close the portal and banish the entities that were haunting us. One text stood out, an old weathered book written in a language I couldn't understand. It took days to translate, but when I finally did, I discovered a ritual that claimed to sever the connection between our world and the other dimension. It was dangerous, requiring a sacrifice, but I was willing to do whatever it took. I gathered the necessary items and prepared for the ritual. That night, as I performed the final steps, the room grew unbearably cold. The shadows deepened, and the whispers grew louder. The entities were there, watching, waiting. I could feel their anger, their hunger. As I completed the ritual, a blinding light filled the room, and I felt a force pulling at my very soul. I screamed, the pain indescribable, as if my entire being was being torn apart. Then just as suddenly, it stopped. The light faded, and the room returned to normal. The entities were gone. Exhausted, I collapsed to the floor, barely conscious. I had done it. I had closed the door, but the cost was high. I could feel the toll it had taken on me, physically and mentally. Nightmares still lingered, and the memories of what I had seen would never fade. I was forever changed, haunted by the knowledge of what lay beyond our world. After the ritual, I thought things might start getting back to normal, but I was wrong. The entities were gone, but the darkness they left behind had seeped into every part of my life. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I couldn't see anything. It felt like the veil between our world and whatever hell we had touched was thinner now, and something else was lurking just out of sight. A few days after the ritual, I started experiencing strange phenomena. Electronics in my apartment would malfunction, flickering lights, TVs turning on and off by themselves, static voices coming through the speakers. One night, as I lay in bed, trying to fall asleep, I heard a faint whispering. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, But then the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were coming from the walls, the floors, everywhere. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The whispers were in that same alien language from the rituals. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. Anger, malice, and something else. Something that sounded like a promise of pain. My heart raced as I realized the entities might not be gone. Maybe the ritual had just angered them. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, twisted and monstrous, staring back at me. The shadows in my apartment seemed to move on their own, creeping closer when I wasn't looking. I started staying up all night, lights on, trying to keep the darkness at bay. It didn't help. I was losing my mind. One evening, I decided to leave the apartment. I couldn't stand being in there any longer. I walked aimlessly through the streets, trying to clear my head. It was late, and the city was eerily quiet. As I walked, I felt that same chilling presence I had felt during the rituals. I looked around, but the streets were empty. Still, the feeling persisted, growing stronger with every step. I ended up at a park, sitting on a bench, trying to collect my thoughts. That's when I saw it. A figure standing under a street lamp, just outside the park. It was one of the entities, but it looked different now. More solid, more real. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of pure terror wash over me. It started moving toward me, slowly, deliberately. I jumped up and ran. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, locking the door behind me. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. They weren't just in my head anymore. They were here, in the real world, and they were coming for me. Over the next few days, I tried to avoid going outside, but it didn't matter. The entities found other ways to torment me. I started receiving strange phone calls, static-filled, with distorted voices speaking that alien language. My email inbox was flooded with messages from unknown senders, filled with cryptic symbols and disturbing images. One email stood out. It had no subject line, no body text, just an attachment, a video file. Against my better judgment, I opened the video. The screen was dark at first, just static and low, droning noise. Then the image flickered to life. It was a recording of me, sitting in my apartment, staring at the computer. But the timestamp was from the night before, when I had been out walking. I watched in horror as the video continued, showing me sitting there, motionless for hours. Then the screen went black, and a single phrase appeared in the same cryptic language. I didn't need to understand the words to know what they meant. They were watching me, always watching, and there was no escape. I felt a cold dread settle over me. I was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. One night, I decided to take a different approach. If they were watching me, maybe I could confront them, find a way to communicate. I set up a camera in my living room, turned off all the lights, and sat in front of it. I started speaking, asking the entities what they wanted, why they were tormenting me. At first, there was nothing, just silence. Then the camera started to glitch. The screen flickered, and I saw their faces, distorted and angry, flashing across the monitor. They were speaking, but their words were garbled, incomprehensible. I felt a sharp pain in my head, like a vice tightening around my skull. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The screen went black again, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, and there it was, one of the entities, standing inches away from me. Its eyes bore into mine, and I felt my mind unraveling. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It reached out, its cold fingers brushing against my skin, and I felt a wave of nausea and pain. The next thing I remember, I was lying on the floor, a camera broken beside me. I was bleeding from my nose and ears, my body shaking uncontrollably. They had made their point. There was no communication, no understanding to be reached. They were here to punish me for my intrusion, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. I'm writing this now as a warning. If you ever come across anything on the deep web promising secrets or hidden knowledge, don't fall for it. Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some knowledge is too dangerous to seek. I learned that the hard way, and now I'm paying the price. After that night, my world turned into a living hell. The entity's presence grew stronger, and their torments more physical. It wasn't just shadows and whispers anymore. They started to manifest in ways that left real marks. I woke up one morning to find deep, red scratches on my back, as if something with claws had raked across my skin while I slept. My bed was soaked in sweat, and I could still feel the burning pain where the marks were. The paranoia was eating me alive. I couldn't trust my senses, couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. I started barricading myself in my apartment, covering the windows, setting up makeshift alarms to alert me if anything tried to get in. But it didn't help. They were already inside, always there, watching, waiting. One particularly harrowing night, I was jolted awake by a loud crash from the kitchen. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife, inching my way towards the noise. The kitchen was trashed, cabinets open, dishes shattered on the floor. And there, in the middle of the chaos, stood one of the entities. It was taller than before, its limbs more defined, almost skeletal, with eyes that glowed a sickly yellow. I froze, unable to move or even scream. It tilted its head, regarding me with a mix of curiosity and malice. Then it spoke, not in the alien language I had heard before, but in a raspy, guttural voice that sounded painfully human. "You opened the door," it said. "Now you must pay the price." It lunged at me, and I instinctively swung the knife. It passed right through the entity like slicing through smoke. The thing laughed, a sound that chilled me to the bone, and then it vanished. I was left standing there, shaking, surrounded by the wreckage. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed help, but who could I turn to? The police would think I was insane, and my friends had already distanced themselves, unable to understand the terror I was living through. I decided to reach out to the remaining participants from the seminar, hoping someone might have found a way to cope or fight back. I managed to contact a few of them. They were all in bad shape, each dealing with their own version of the nightmare. One of them, a woman named Lisa, seemed to have some knowledge about what we were dealing with. She mentioned an old book she had found, something that talked about the entities and how to possibly banish them. She was hesitant to share more over the phone, insisting we meet in person. Desperation drove me to agree. We set a time and place, a public park during the day. When I arrived, I barely recognized her. She looked gaunt, her eyes sunken and haunted. She clutched a worn, leather-bound book to her chest, like it was a lifeline. Lisa explained that the entities were ancient, malevolent beings that thrived on fear and pain. The rituals we performed had acted as invitations, binding them to us. The book contained counter rituals, but they were risky and required absolute precision. Any mistake could make things worse. We decided to perform the banishment ritual together, hoping that combining our efforts might increase our chances of success. The ritual needed to be done at midnight, in a secluded place, away from prying eyes. We chose an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. That night, as we set up the ritual, the air grew thick with tension. Lisa drew the symbols on the floor with salt, and I prepared the candles and other items. We could feel the entities watching, their presence oppressive and suffocating. As the clock struck midnight, we began. The ritual was intense, requiring chants, precise movements, and absolute focus. As we progressed, the air grew colder, and the shadows around us seemed to writhe and pulse. Halfway through, Lisa screamed, clutching her head. I turned to see her eyes rolling back, her body convulsing. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to continue the ritual. The shadows grew darker, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, but I didn't stop. I chanted louder, pouring every ounce of my will into the ritual. The grip tightened, and I felt icy fingers dig into my flesh, but I kept going. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light, and a deafening roar filled the air. The ground shook, and the symbols on the floor glowed with an eerie light. The entities shrieked, their forms flickering and distorting. With one final chant, there was an explosion of light, and then everything went silent. I collapsed, gasping for breath. Lisa lay motionless beside me. I crawled over to her, praying she was still alive. Her eyes fluttered open, and she managed a weak smile. "We did it," she whispered. "They're gone." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I helped Lisa to her feet, I noticed something in the corner of the warehouse, an old dusty mirror. My blood ran cold. In the reflection, I saw not just Lisa and me, but one of the entities standing right behind us, its eyes glowing with malevolent glee. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just shadows and silence. The entities might be banished, but the scars they left were permanent. I knew they would always be a part of me, lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for a moment of weakness. Lisa and I parted ways after that night. Both of us changed forever. I moved to a new city, trying to start fresh, but the memories haunt me every day. I can't look into mirrors without seeing those twisted faces. Can't sleep without the fear of waking up to find them standing over me. I've learned to live with it, but the fear never truly goes away. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. Despite moving to a new city and trying to start over, I could never truly escape the horrors I had unleashed. The memories of the entities, the rituals, and the torment haunted me day and night. My new apartment was sparse, devoid of personal touches, just the bare essentials. I kept my windows covered and avoided reflective surfaces as much as possible. But the paranoia lingered, an ever-present shadow that tainted every aspect of my life. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day at work, I returned home to find a package waiting for me outside my door. There was no return address, just my name scrawled in messy handwriting. A chill ran down my spine as I picked it up and brought it inside. I debated whether to open it, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside the package was an old tattered journal and a note. The note was from Lisa. My heart sank as I read her words. "I've found something. They're not truly gone. This journal might have the answers. Be careful." I flipped through the journal, the pages filled with handwritten notes, sketches, and strange symbols. It detailed the experiences of someone who had encountered similar entities decades ago. The journal's author described how the entities could never be fully banished, only contained, and how they always sought a way back into our world. One entry stood out. It described a final ritual, one that required the sacrifice of the person who opened the door in the first place. My blood ran cold. Could I do it? Could I make the ultimate sacrifice to end this nightmare once and for all? That night, I had the most vivid dream. I was back in the warehouse, the symbols glowing on the floor, the entities circling around me. They whispered promises of power, knowledge, and release from my torment if I would only let them back in. I woke up drenched in sweat, my mind racing. I knew what I had to do. I spent the next few days preparing for the ritual. The instructions were clear, but terrifying. I needed to perform it at the place where it all began, the spot where I first saw the entities. I gathered the necessary items: candles, salt, ceremonial knife, and the journal. On the night of the new moon, I drove back to the abandoned warehouse. The air was thick with anticipation and dread as I set up the ritual. The warehouse was deathly silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I drew the symbols on the floor, placed the candles, and stood in the center. As I began the chant, the temperature plummeted and the shadows around me started to move. The entities appeared, their forms flickering in and out of existence. They circled me, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. I forced myself to continue, even as their cold fingers brushed against my skin. The final part of the ritual required a blood sacrifice, my blood. With trembling hands, I took the ceremonial knife and made a deep cut across my palm, letting the blood drip onto the symbols. The pain was intense, but I kept chanting. The entities shrieked, their forms distorting as the symbols glowed brighter. Then the ground beneath me started to shake. The air filled with a blinding light, and I felt a force pulling at my very soul. The entities screamed, a sound that echoed through my mind, tearing at my sanity. The light grew brighter, and I felt myself being lifted off the ground, suspended in the air. In that moment, I saw everything. Their world, a twisted, nightmarish landscape filled with horrors beyond comprehension. The entities were desperate, clawing at the fabric of reality, trying to pull me into their realm. But the ritual was working. The light intensified, and I felt a surge of power coursing through me. With one final chant, there was an explosion of light and sound, and the entities were ripped away, their screams fading into nothingness. I collapsed to the floor, the symbols on the ground smoldering. The silence that followed was deafening. I lay there for what felt like hours, too weak to move. Slowly, the pain in my body subsided, and I felt a strange sense of peace. I had done it. The entities were gone. The door closed, but I knew the cost had been high. When I finally managed to get to my feet, I saw my reflection in a shard of broken glass. I looked older, worn, and haggard. The scars from the rituals were still there, a permanent reminder of the nightmare I had endured. But for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. I returned to my apartment, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy. The fear and paranoia were still there, lurking in the back of my mind, but the entities were gone. I could feel it. The veil between our worlds was secure once more. I decided to keep the journal, a reminder of the horrors I had faced and the strength it took to overcome them. Life would never be the same, but I had a chance to rebuild, to move forward. If there's one thing I learned from this ordeal, it's that some knowledge is too dangerous to seek. Some doors are meant to stay closed. And if you ever find yourself tempted by the secrets of the unknown, remember my story. Sometimes the price of curiosity is too high to pay. I downloaded an app of the deep web that generates a location close to your place where you live that are haunted. Hey everyone, I'm not one for sharing personal experiences on the internet, especially not something as messed up as this, but I feel like I need to get it off my chest. Maybe it'll help me sleep better at night. So here it goes. It all started a few months ago. I was browsing some forums on the deep web, just out of curiosity. I know, it was stupid, but I'd always been fascinated by the dark corners of the internet. Most of it was just boring, illegal stuff. But then I stumbled upon this thread about an app that could find haunted locations near you. The thread had a mix of people swearing it was fake, and others claiming they had the scariest experiences of their lives because of it. Naturally, my morbid curiosity got the better of me. The app was called Ghostnear, and it was surprisingly easy to download. The interface was basic, nothing special, but it had this eerie, glitchy background music that immediately put me on edge. There was a single button in the middle of the screen that said, "Find haunted places near you." I hesitated for a second, but then I thought, what's the worst that could happen? And pressed the button. It took a few seconds to load, and then it showed me a list of locations. Some were famous local legends, but others were just random places I'd never heard of. One in particular caught my eye. It was an old, abandoned house, just a few miles from my apartment. The app said it was haunted by the ghost of a woman who had killed her entire family before taking her own life. Classic horror movie stuff, right? I decided to check it out. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, which in hindsight was a huge mistake. I just grabbed my flashlight, hopped in my car, and drove over there. It was late, probably around midnight by the time I got there. The house was exactly what you'd expect from a haunted house. Run down, overgrown with weeds, and just exuding an air of malevolence. I parked a little ways down the street and approached the house. As I got closer, I could feel this strange pressure in the air, like the atmosphere was heavier. My flashlight flickered a bit, but I chalked it up to bad batteries. The front door was slightly ajar, so I pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. It was a mix of mold, rot, and something else I couldn't quite place. It made me gag, but I pressed on. The interior was just as decayed as the outside, with broken furniture and graffiti everywhere. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. I kept hearing these faint whispers, but every time I stopped to listen, they would go silent. Then I found the basement door. It was locked, but the lock was so rusty it broke off with a little force. As I opened the door, a cold breeze hit me, sending chills down my spine. The steps creaked under my weight as I descended, the darkness swallowing my flashlight's beam. The basement was pitch black and freezing. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I started to regret coming here. But then I saw her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I shone my flashlight in her direction, there was no denying it. A woman, or what was left of her, stood in the corner. Her skin was pale and translucent, her eyes hollow pits of darkness. She was covered in blood, holding a knife with a wicked grin on her face. I froze. I wanted to run, scream, anything, but my body wouldn't cooperate. She started moving towards me, her movements jerky and unnatural. The whispers grew louder, and I realized they were coming from her. She was saying something about needing more blood, more souls. I finally managed to break free from my paralysis and bolted up the stairs, the basement door slamming shut behind me. I ran out of the house and didn't stop until I was back in my car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. I haven't been able to get her out of my mind since that night. I deleted the app, but it didn't help. I keep seeing her in my dreams, standing at the foot of my bed with that same bloodied knife and grin. Sometimes I wake up with scratches on my body that I can't explain. I don't know if it's my mind playing tricks on me or if she's really here, but either way, I'm terrified. Part of me wants to go back to that house to find out what really happened there, but another part of me knows that if I do, I might not make it out alive. I thought that by avoiding the house and deleting the app, things would eventually go back to normal. I was dead wrong. Over the next few days, my life turned into a waking nightmare. It started small. I'd hear footsteps in my apartment at odd hours of the night, even though I live alone. At first, I convinced myself it was just the building settling, or maybe the neighbors, but then the noises became more specific. Soft, deliberate steps that always stopped right outside my bedroom door. I'd lie in bed, paralyzed with fear, clutching my phone and trying to convince myself to look, but I never did. Then there were the shadows. I'd catch them out of the corner of my eye, flickering and moving when they shouldn't be. I'd be watching TV or cooking dinner, and suddenly the room would grow cold, and I'd see a dark figure standing in the hallway. Every time I turned to look directly, it would disappear. I started leaving all the lights on, hoping it would make me feel safer, but it didn't. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. Whenever I did manage to drift off, the dreams were filled with her. She would be standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes boring into me, the knife in her hand dripping with fresh blood. Sometimes she'd whisper to me, her voice a rasping, chilling sound that echoed in my mind long after I woke up. "More blood," she'd say, "more souls." And one night I woke up to find her sitting on my chest, pinning me down. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her face was inches from mine, her hollow eyes staring into my soul. "You brought me back," she hissed. "You owe me." I gasped for air, and she vanished, leaving me shaking and drenched in sweat. Desperation drove me to seek help. I talked to a friend who was into paranormal stuff, hoping she'd have some advice. She suggested cleansing rituals, protective charms, and even a priest. I tried everything: sage smudging, salt circles, prayers, but nothing worked. If anything, it seemed to make her angrier. One night, as I was performing yet another futile cleansing ritual, I heard a loud crash from my bathroom. I rushed in, and my heart nearly stopped. The mirror had shattered, but instead of broken glass on the floor, there was blood. Thick, dark blood dripping down the shards, spelling out a message: "You can't escape." I bolted from my apartment and drove around aimlessly, too scared to go back. I ended up at a bar, drinking myself into oblivion, hoping it would numb the terror. But even in the crowded, noisy bar, I couldn't escape her. I saw her reflection in the bar's mirrors, in the glass of my drink, in the eyes of the people around me. She was everywhere. Things escalated quickly after that. I'd wake up with bruises and cuts that I couldn't explain. Objects in my apartment would move on their own. Doors would slam shut. Lights would flicker. And the whispers would follow me wherever I went. I was living in a state of constant fear, jumping at every little noise, every unexpected movement. One particularly bad night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, thinking that maybe if I confronted her, if I fought back, she'd leave me alone. I know how crazy that sounds, but I was at my breaking point. I sat in my living room, the knife in my trembling hand, and waited. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Just as I started to think I might be safe, the temperature dropped suddenly, and the lights flickered out. She was there, standing in the doorway, her grin wider than ever. "Why are you doing this?" I screamed, my voice cracking with fear. "What do you want from me?" She moved closer, her form shifting and flickering like a bad signal. "You brought me back," she whispered. "Now you must pay the price." Before I could react, she lunged at me. I slashed wildly with the knife, but it passed right through her. She was on me in an instant, her cold, dead hands wrapping around my throat. I struggled, gasping for breath, my vision dimming. Her face was inches from mine, her breath like ice on my skin. "More blood," she hissed. "More souls." Everything went black. I woke up on the floor, the knife still clutched in my hand. There were deep scratches on my neck, and blood smeared across the carpet. I knew then that this wasn't something I could escape from. She was a part of me now, and no matter where I went, she'd follow. I haven't left my apartment in days. I can't eat, can't sleep, can't think straight. The whispers are constant now, a background noise I can't escape. I see her everywhere, feel her cold touch on my skin. I don't know how much longer I can take this. I thought about ending it, just to make it stop, but I'm too scared that even death won't free me from her. Too scared that I'll end up just like her, trapped in that house, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble in. And so, I wait. I wait for the day she finally takes me, for the day I can't fight anymore. Until then, I'm just trying to survive, one terror-filled night at a time. As the days turned into weeks, my grip on reality began to slip. I lost my job because I couldn't muster the courage to leave my apartment. My friends and family stopped calling after I ignored their messages for too long. I was completely isolated, left alone with my fears and the constant presence of her. The only company I had were the whispers and the shadows that seemed to close in on me more each day. I tried to distract myself by binge-watching TV shows or playing video games, but nothing could hold my attention. The fear was always there, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. One night, as I lay on my couch staring blankly at the ceiling, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The air grew colder, and I knew she was near. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from all around me. I turned on every light in the apartment, hoping it would somehow keep her at bay, but the shadows only grew darker, more defined. I saw her standing in the corner of my living room, her eyes locked onto mine. She didn't move, just watched me with that same eerie grin. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and without thinking, opened the app again. I don't know what I was hoping for. Maybe some answers, maybe a way to undo what I'd done. But as soon as the app loaded, the screen went black. Then a single message appeared. "She's coming for you." I dropped the phone, my hands trembling. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. I could hear her voice clearer than ever. "More blood," she whispered. "More souls." I ran to the bathroom and locked the door behind me. I turned on the shower, the sink, anything to drown out the sound of her voice. But it didn't help. I could still hear her, feel her presence creeping closer. Suddenly, the lights in the bathroom flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of my phone on the floor outside the door. I could hear her now, right outside. Her breathing was shallow, raspy, as if it was coming from a long dead throat. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. The door handle rattled, and then it began to slowly open. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. She was there, standing in the doorway, her figure silhouetted against the faint light from the hallway. She stepped inside, her movements slow and deliberate. "You can't escape," she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. "You belong to me now." I don't know what came over me, but in that moment, something inside me snapped. I lunged at her, my hands outstretched, hoping to somehow push her away. But as soon as I touched her, a searing pain shot through my entire body. It was like touching a live wire, my muscles spasming uncontrollably. I collapsed to the floor, convulsing, as she stood over me, watching with that same twisted smile. "More blood," she whispered. "More souls." I woke up in a hospital bed, my body aching all over. The doctor said I had suffered some kind of seizure, but they couldn't explain the burn marks on my hands or the deep scratches on my neck. They kept me under observation for a few days, but eventually they had to let me go. There was nothing physically wrong with me, they said. It was all in my head. When I returned to my apartment, everything seemed normal at first. The shadows were gone, the whispers silent. I thought maybe, just maybe, it was finally over. But that night, as I lay in bed, I felt her presence again. The room grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. I opened my eyes, and there she was, standing at the foot of my bed. "You can't escape," she whispered, her eyes boring into mine. "You belong to me now." I don't know how much longer I can take this. Every night is a battle to keep my sanity, to fight the urge to give in to the darkness. I don't know what she wants or why she's chosen me, but I know one thing for sure. I can't keep living like this. I've started researching ways to banish spirits, to break curses, but everything I try seems to make things worse. The whispers grow louder, the shadows darker. I'm running out of options, out of hope. I fear that soon I'll be just like her, trapped in this nightmare, forever seeking more blood, more souls. Desperation had become my constant companion. I hadn't slept in days, my mind a fog of fear and exhaustion. The dark circles under my eyes were a testament to the relentless torment. Each night she came, her whispers growing louder, more insistent. "More blood," she would say, her voice a raspy echo in my mind. "More souls." One evening, as I sat huddled in the corner of my living room, trying to ignore the shadows creeping along the walls, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. The message simply read, "I can help you. Meet me at the old cemetery at midnight." Ordinarily, I would have dismissed it as a prank, but I was too far gone for rational thought. This might be my last chance. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, the night air cold and unforgiving. The streets were deserted, the city eerily silent as I made my way to the cemetery. The cemetery was a place I had always avoided. It was old, overgrown, and filled with decaying headstones that seemed to whisper their own tales of sorrow and death. As I walked through the rusted gates, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and decay, and the moon cast long, twisted shadows that seemed to reach out and grab at my feet. I wandered through the rows of graves until I saw a figure standing by an old, crumbling mausoleum. He was tall and thin, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. As I approached, he turned to face me, revealing eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural light. "You've been marked," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "The spirit that haunts you is powerful, bound by a blood curse, but there is a way to break it. I was skeptical but desperate. "What do I have to do?" I asked, my voice trembling. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "This contains the ritual," he said, handing it to me. "It must be performed at the place where the spirit was first summoned. You have to go back to the house." The thought of returning to that place filled me with dread, but I knew I had no other choice. The man gave me a few more instructions and then vanished into the night, leaving me alone with the book and my fear. I spent the next day preparing. The ritual required specific items: candles, herbs, a knife, and disturbingly, a small amount of my own blood. I gathered everything and waited for nightfall. As the sun set, I felt a sense of impending doom settle over me. This was it. Either I would free myself from this nightmare, or I would be consumed by it. I drove to the house, my hands gripping the steering wheel, so tightly my knuckles turned white. The house looked even more sinister than before, its broken windows like empty eye sockets staring into my soul. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay, the shadows dancing on the walls as if mocking me. I made my way to the basement door, the memory of my last encounter there fresh in my mind. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness. I set up the candles in a circle, placing the herbs in the center along with the knife. The book lay open beside me, its pages filled with strange symbols and incantations. I began the ritual, chanting the words as best as I could, my voice shaking with fear. As I spoke, the temperature dropped, and I could see my breath forming in the air. The shadows around me grew darker, more defined, and the whispers began anew. "More blood," they said. "More souls." I took the knife and made a small cut on my palm, letting the blood drip onto the herbs. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I could feel her presence growing stronger. She was coming. Suddenly, she was there, standing outside the circle of candles, her eyes blazing with fury. "You cannot escape," she hissed. "You belong to me." I continued the chant, my voice growing louder, more confident. The candles flickered, the flames dancing wildly. She stepped closer, but the circle seemed to hold her back. I finished the incantation and threw the book into the center of the circle. There was a blinding flash of light, and I felt a force knock me backward. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. The shadows had receded, the whispers silenced. I sat there in stunned silence, my heart pounding in my chest. It was over, or so I thought. I left the house, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. I drove home, hoping that I could finally get some rest, but as I walked through my front door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on my living room wall, was a message scrawled in blood. "You can't escape. More blood. More souls." The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The sight of those bloodied words on my living room wall shattered any hope I had left. The calm I had felt after the ritual was nothing more than a cruel illusion. I was still trapped, still hunted. The entity was more powerful than I had imagined, and it wasn't going to let me go easily. I knew I couldn't stay in my apartment, so I packed a bag with some essentials and left, not caring where I ended up. I drove aimlessly through the city, my mind racing. There had to be a way to end this, a way to break free, but who could I turn to? The man at the cemetery had vanished, and I had no one else to ask for help. I ended up at a motel on the outskirts of town, a dingy place with flickering neon lights and an apathetic clock who barely looked up as I checked in. The room was small and smelled faintly of mildew, but it felt safer than my apartment. I locked the door, barricaded it with a chair, and tried to get some rest. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, her hollow eyes staring into mine. The whispers returned, growing louder and more insistent. "More blood," they said. "More souls." I lay there, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. Around 3 a.m., the lights in my room began to flicker. I sat up, my body tense with fear. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath in the air. She was here. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew deafening, and I felt a cold hand wrap around my wrist, pulling me back. I screamed and thrashed, but there was no escape. She was everywhere, her presence suffocating. "You can't run," she hissed, her voice echoing in my mind. "You belong to me now." In a last-ditch effort, I remembered the book and the man's warning about the house. Maybe there was something I had missed, something I hadn't done right. I needed to go back to confront her once and for all. It was a suicide mission, but I had no other choice. I managed to break free from her grip and dashed out of the motel room. The drive to the house was a blur. My mind focused solely on surviving the night. When I arrived, the house loomed in the darkness, even more menacing than before. The windows were dark, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The familiar smells of rot and decay greeted me, and the shadows seemed to welcome me back. I made my way to the basement, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The candles from the ritual were still there, but the circle had been broken, the book gone. I heard her whispers closer than ever. "More blood," she said. "More souls." She appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes glowing with malevolent glee. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," I said, my voice shaking. "You can't control me." She laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. "You think you have a choice? You brought me back. You're mine." I knew I had to finish what I started. I needed to bind her, to trap her spirit once and for all. I searched the basement, my hands shaking, until I found a small box hidden in the shadows. Inside was another book, older and more decrepit than the first. It contained the binding ritual, the final step I had missed. I set up the candles again, this time in a more complex pattern. The whispers grew louder, and I could feel her presence closing in. I began the chant, my voice steady despite the terror gnawing at my insides. She screamed, a sound of pure rage and hatred, but I didn't stop. The room grew colder, the shadows darker, but I kept chanting. As I finished the ritual, there was a blinding flash of light, and the air was filled with a deafening silence. I opened my eyes, and she was gone. The basement was empty, the air warm and still. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, the oppressive presence that had haunted me finally gone. I left the house, feeling a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. I drove back to my apartment, half expecting to see another message scrawled in blood, but there was nothing. The shadows were just shadows, and the whispers were gone. I don't know what happened to her spirit, whether it was truly bound or if it was just waiting for another unsuspecting soul to summon it. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never, ever mess with the deep web or anything remotely supernatural again. As I lay in bed that night, finally able to sleep, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. I had survived. I had faced my worst fears and come out the other side. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally move on, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear a faint whisper, just at the edge of hearing. More blood, it says, more souls, and I wonder if I ever truly escaped. I am a money collector. I bought banknote of the deep web, and I think they might be from the future. Hey Reddit, I've been lurking here for a while, but this is my first time posting. I need to share what happened to me, because I honestly don't know what to do, and maybe someone out there can help, or at least believe me. I'm a money collector. He have been for years. I've always been fascinated with currency, especially old and rare banknotes, but this is something else. So a few months back, I was browsing the deep web. Yeah, I know, not the safest place to be, but that's where you can find the rarest stuff. I stumbled upon a listing that caught my eye, banknotes from the future. The description was vague, almost like it was trying to be cryptic, but it mentioned dates that were decades ahead of our time and designs that don't exist yet. I thought it was some kind of joke or scam, but the curiosity got the best of me. I contacted the seller, and after a bit of back and forth, I wired him $500 through Bitcoin. A couple of weeks later, a small plain brown package arrived at my door. Inside were 5 banknotes, neatly wrapped in plastic. The first thing I noticed was how pristine they looked, like they had just been printed. The designs were off. They didn't resemble anything from any country I knew, and the dates were all in the 2040s. But the weirdest part was the images on the notes. They weren't of famous historical figures or landmarks. They were scenes, detailed, disturbing scenes. One note showed a city in ruins, buildings crumbling, fires burning. Another depicted a group of people, but their faces were blank, almost like they were erased. The third one showed a forest, but the trees were twisted, almost human-like, with faces screaming in agony. The fourth note had an image of a hospital, but the patients were strapped to their beds, eyes wide open, mouths frozen in silent screams. The last one, and the most disturbing, had a picture of a man standing in a dark room with eyes all over the walls staring at him. At first, I thought it was some sick art project, but then things started to happen. Weird things. The night I received the notes, I had a dream. I was in that ruined city from the first note. The sky was a sickly yellow, the air thick with smoke and ash. People were running, screaming, but their faces were blank, just like on the notes. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. I tried to brush it off as a nightmare, but it felt too real. Over the next few days, I started to notice changes around me. Small at first, but then more drastic. My phone would ring, but when I answered, there was just static. I started seeing shadows in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Then things got worse. One evening, I was watching TV when I heard a noise from my bedroom. It sounded like whispering. I paused the TV and listened, but it stopped. I shrugged it off and went to bed. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone crying. It was faint, but it was there. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and checked every room, but I was alone. The crying continued for a few nights, always around the same time. One night, as I lay in bed, the crying turned into laughter. It was a child's laughter, soft and innocent at first, but it grew louder and more maniacal. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move. The laughter echoed through my house, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I clutched the banknotes, hoping it would stop, and then, As suddenly as it started, it ceased. That's when I decided to get rid of the notes. I burned them in my backyard, watching as the flames consumed them. I thought it was over, but it was just the beginning. A few nights later, I woke up to find my bedroom door open. I never sleep with it open. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall and shadowy. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I wanted to scream, to get up and run, but my body wouldn't obey. We stayed like that for what felt like hours until it finally turned and disappeared into the hallway. Since then, I've been seeing things, shadows moving on their own, figures standing at the end of my bed, whispers in my ears. I've tried everything, burning sage, calling a priest, even moving to a new apartment. Nothing works. They followed me. They're always there, watching, waiting. I don't know what those banknotes were or where they came from, but I'm convinced they brought something with them, something evil. If you ever come across anything like that, don't buy it. Don't even look at it. I'm posting this because I'm desperate. If anyone knows how to stop this, please help me. I don't know how much more I can take. After that night, sleep became a rare luxury. I'd lay in bed, eyes wide open, waiting for the inevitable sound of whispers or the sudden appearance of those shadowy figures. The thing that scared me the most was the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just in my head. I could feel it, a heavy presence pressing down on me, sucking the air from the room. One particularly bad night, I decided to record everything while I slept. I set up my laptop with a webcam pointing at my bed, hoping to catch something, anything, that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. The next morning, I eagerly reviewed the footage. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Just me, tossing and turning, clearly uneasy. But around 3:15 a.m., things changed. The door to my bedroom, which I had locked, slowly creaked open. I watched in horror as the same tall, shadowy figure from before stepped into the frame. It stood there, watching me sleep, for what seemed like an eternity. Then it did something that sent chills down my spine. It turned its head slowly and looked directly at the camera. It had no face, just an empty void where features should have been, but I knew it saw me. I could feel its gaze through the screen. In a panic, I slammed my laptop shut and tried to rationalize what I had seen. It couldn't be real. Maybe I had been sleepwalking, or maybe it was some sort of elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew that whatever had come with those banknotes was real, and it was getting stronger. Desperate for answers, I turned to the deep web again, hoping to find the seller or anyone who knew more about these cursed notes. I posted on forums describing my experience in detail, but most people dismissed it as a hoax or a bad trip. Then I got a private message from someone with the username Watcher2040. They claimed to know about the notes and offered to help, but their tone was off. They warned me that seeking answers would only make things worse, but I had no choice. I needed to know. We arranged a video call, and when the screen flickered to life, I was greeted by an older man, his face lined with worry and fear. He introduced himself as Jack, a former collector who had encountered the notes years ago. Jack explained that the notes were indeed from the future, but they were more than just currency. They were markers, warnings from a time ravaged by unspeakable horrors. He told me about the first time he saw the notes, how he too was drawn to them out of curiosity. His life fell apart soon after. His wife left him, unable to cope with the strange occurrences. His friends thought he was crazy. He had been alone for years, haunted by the same figures and whispers that now tormented me. Jack's voice trembled as he spoke, recounting the things he had seen, glimpses of the future, twisted and dark, filled with suffering and despair. I asked him how to stop it, how to break free, but his face fell. He didn't know. He had tried everything, just like me. The only thing that seemed to help, albeit temporarily, was staying constantly on the move, never staying in one place for too long. He warned me that the entities were drawn to fear and despair, feeding off it, growing stronger. Our call ended with Jack promising to send me some information, old research he had compiled over the years. I thanked him, feeling a mix of relief and dread. At least I wasn't alone, but the thought of living like this forever was unbearable. A few days later, I received an email from Jack with several attachments, scanned pages of notes, old photographs, and what looked like a diary. As I read through them, a chilling pattern emerged. Every person who had owned the notes had experienced similar horrors, shadows, whispers, visions of a bleak future. But there was something else, something that Jack hadn't mentioned on the call. One of the diary entries detailed a ritual, a way to possibly send the entities back to where they came from. It involved gathering specific items and performing the ritual at precisely 3:33 a.m., the time when the veil between our world and theirs was thinnest. The items were strange: a mirror, a piece of obsidian, and a personal item from someone who had passed away. Determined to end this nightmare, I set out to gather everything I needed. The mirror was easy. I had one in my bathroom. The obsidian took a bit more effort, but I managed to find a piece at a local gem shop. The lost item, however, was the hardest. My parents had passed away years ago, and I didn't have anything of theirs left. I remembered an old photo album tucked away in a box in my closet. Flipping through the pages, I found a small locket that had belonged to my mother. It was perfect. With everything ready, I prepared myself for the ritual. That night, at 3:30 a.m., I sat up in my living room. I placed the mirror on the floor, the obsidian on top of it, and held the locket tightly in my hand. As the clock ticked closer to 3:33, the air grew colder and the whispers started again. I began the incantation from Jack's notes, my voice shaking. At exactly 3:33, a sudden silence fell over the room, as if the world had paused. Then the mirror shattered, and the shadows around me coalesced into a single, towering figure. It reached out, and for a moment, I thought I was done for. But then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, taking the whispers and the cold with it. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. It seemed to be over. The house was quiet, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. But as I lay there, catching my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The future those banknotes depicted was still out there, waiting. After the ritual, I thought I could finally return to some semblance of normalcy. For a few weeks, things did seem better. The shadows no longer lurked in the corners, and the whispers had ceased. I started sleeping through the night again, cautiously optimistic that the nightmare was over. But deep down, I couldn't shake the unease that lingered. It started subtly. One morning, I found the locket, the one I used in the ritual, placed neatly on my nightstand. I distinctly remembered packing it away with the other items, intent on forgetting the whole ordeal. My first instinct was to chalk it up to absent-mindedness, but the creeping sensation of being watched returned. One evening, I got an unexpected knock on my door. I peered through the peephole to see a man in a tattered coat, his eyes wild and unfocused. Reluctantly, I opened the door a crack. "Are you the one who bought the notes?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper. My heart sank. "Who are you?" "They call me the Keeper," he replied. "I was the owner before you. I need to warn you." He pushed his way in before I could stop him. He reeked of sweat and desperation, his eyes darting around my apartment like he was expecting something to leap out of the shadows. We sat at the kitchen table, and he began to tell me his story. The Keeper had been an avid collector too, drawn in by the promise of unique and rare banknotes. He explained how he'd found the same listing on the deep web, and like me, couldn't resist the temptation. But his experience had been far worse. He showed me scars on his arms and legs, thin, jagged lines that he claimed were from the entities that haunted him. "They're drawn to the notes, to the energy they hold," he explained. "The ritual you performed, it doesn't end them. It only sends them away temporarily. They always come back." A cold chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" He leaned in closer, his breath foul and hot. "They feed on our fear, our despair. As long as those emotions exist, they have a way back. The only way to truly stop them is to destroy the source." I knew what he meant, the notes, but I had burned them. Hadn't I? He shook his head, reading my thoughts. "The notes can't be destroyed so easily. They're not just paper. They're a part of what's to come. To truly end this, you have to confront the future they depict." With that cryptic advice, the Keeper left, warning me to stay vigilant. His words echoed in my mind for days. What did he mean by confronting the future? How could I fight something that hadn't happened yet? That night, I had another dream. I was back in the City of Ruins, but this time, it was more vivid, more real. I could feel the heat of the fires, smell the acrid smoke. The faceless people were there again, but they seemed closer, their blank stares more accusing. I ran through the streets, searching for something, anything that could make sense of it all. I found myself at the edge of the city, where a massive wall of darkness loomed. From it, shadowy figures emerged, reaching out for me. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I needed answers. I needed to find out where these notes came from and what they meant. Desperation drove me back to the deep web, hoping to find the seller or anyone who knew more about the origin of these cursed notes. Days turned into nights as I scoured forums and obscure sites, my obsession growing. Then I found a thread mentioning a man named Dr. Elias Harker, a historian who had supposedly researched these notes and their origins. According to the thread, Dr. Harker had disappeared under mysterious circumstances shortly after publishing his findings. Using what little information I could find, I tracked down his last known address, an old, decrepit house on the outskirts of town. It was a place straight out of a horror movie, with overgrown weeds and broken windows. I hesitated at the front door, the wood splintered and rotting, but I knew I had to go in. Inside, the house was dark and musty, filled with stacks of papers and books. I called out, but no one answered. As I explored, I found a small study, its walls lined with shelves crammed with more documents. On the desk was a journal, Dr. Harker's last entries. His writings were frantic, detailing his discovery of the notes and his subsequent research. He believed they were artifacts from a dystopian future, sent back in time as a warning, or perhaps a curse. He had traced their origins to a secret society obsessed with altering the course of history, using the notes as a tool to manipulate events and spread chaos. The final entry sent chills down my spine. They are coming for me. The shadows grow bolder, their whispers louder. I fear I have uncovered too much. If anyone reads this, know that the notes are a key to a future we must prevent. But to do so, you must face the darkness within and the horrors that lie ahead. As I finished reading, I heard a noise from behind me. I turned to see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, its form shifting and writhing. My blood ran cold as it stepped closer, the room growing darker with each step. In a panic, I grabbed the journal and fled the house, the figure's whispering voice echoing in my ears, promising pain and suffering. Back at my apartment, I pored over Dr. Harker's notes, looking for a way to end this. The answer seemed to lie in the notes themselves, in the future they depicted. I had to find a way to confront the events they showed and stop them from happening. But how do you fight a future that hasn't happened yet? How do you change something that seems inevitable? The only thing I knew for sure was that time was running out. The shadows were growing stronger, their presence more menacing. I had to find a way to stop them before the future they came from became my reality. The next few days were a blur of fear and desperation. Every shadow seemed to move with malevolent intent. Every whisper carried a threat. I couldn't escape the feeling that something terrible was just around the corner. Dr. Harker's notes were my only lifeline, and I clung to them, searching for any clue that might save me. One passage mentioned a place called the Nexus, described as a point where the boundaries between our time and the future, depicted by the notes, were weakest. According to Harker, this nexus could be used to confront the future head-on, to change the course of events and break the cycle. The problem was, Harker's notes were maddeningly vague about its location. All I had were cryptic hints and references to old maps. I spent hours scouring the internet, visiting libraries, and even consulting old cartography books. Finally, I found a lead. The Nexus was supposedly located in an abandoned factory on the outskirts of a nearby town. The factory had been shut down for decades, a relic of a bygone era. It seemed like the perfect place for something otherworldly to exist. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of dread, I drove out to the factory one night. The building loomed in the darkness, a monolithic structure of rusted metal and broken windows. The air was thick with the decay and something else, an almost palpable sense of wrongness. As I stepped inside, the floorboards creaked under my weight, echoing through the empty halls. I followed the directions in Harker's notes, navigating through a labyrinth of corridors and staircases until I reached what must have been the heart of the factory. There, in a vast, empty room, I saw it. A large circular pattern etched into the floor, intricate and unsettling. It pulsed with a faint, eerie light. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I stepped into the circle, the air around me seemed to ripple, and the room grew colder. I took out the notes and began the incantation Harker had transcribed, my voice trembling. The ground beneath me vibrated, and the light grew brighter, blindingly so. Suddenly, I was no longer in the factory. I found myself in the ruined city from my dreams, but this time, I was awake. The sky was that sickly yellow, the air thick with smoke. Faceless people wandered the streets, their blank stares piercing through me. I realized I was at the Nexus, a bridge between my world and the future the notes foretold. I wandered through the city, horrified by the scenes of devastation. Fires burned unchecked, and buildings crumbled around me. The air was filled with screams, and the eerie silence of despair. I had to find the source of this nightmare, the heart of the Nexus, and destroy it. As I moved deeper into the city, I saw more of the twisted trees, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. The ground was littered with ash and debris, and the shadows seemed to follow me, growing more tangible with each step. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling my mind with dark thoughts. I reached what appeared to be the center of the city, a massive building that looked like a fusion of a cathedral and a factory. The doors were ajar, and I could see a dim light flickering inside. Summoning all my courage, I stepped through. The interior was vast and oppressive, filled with machinery and altars. At the far end of the room stood a figure, shrouded in darkness, its form shifting and flickering like a bad signal. This was the heart of the Nexus, the entity that controlled the shadows and the whispers. I approached cautiously, my flashlight flickering. The figure turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw its true form, a mass of darkness with countless eyes staring out from within. It spoke, its voice a chorus of whispers. "You cannot stop what is to come," it said. "The future is inevitable. You will become one of us." I took out the locket, the obsidian, and the mirror, arranging them in a triangle at my feet. I began the incantation, my voice steady despite the terror gripping my heart. The ground trembled, and the light in the room pulsed violently. The entity screamed, a sound that seemed to pierce my very soul. The eyes closed, one by one, and the darkness began to recede. The machinery ground to a halt, and the altars crumbled. The room grew brighter, the oppressive weight lifting. With one final scream, the entity vanished, and I was thrown back into the factory. The Nexus closed behind me. I lay on the cold, hard floor, gasping for breath, my body aching. The air was still and silent, the sense of wrongness gone. I had done it. I had confronted the future and stopped the entities. But as I got to my feet and made my way out of the factory, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. The future was still out there, waiting, and the notes, they were a warning. Back in my apartment, I collapsed into bed, exhausted but relieved. I still had Dr. Harker's journal, filled with more questions than answers. The future was uncertain, but for now, I had a reprieve. I knew I would never be the same, but I had faced the darkness and survived. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder if the notes were a warning, who had sent them, and what else might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. For a few weeks, I lived in a state of uneasy calm. The shadows no longer followed me, the whispers had ceased, and the sense of being watched had faded. But a part of me knew it was only a matter of time before something happened again. The events I had experienced left me scarred, both physically and mentally. One evening, as I was going through Dr. Harker's journal for the umpteenth time, I noticed something I had missed before. In the margins of one of the pages, there was a tiny, almost imperceptible drawing of a symbol. It was the same symbol etched into the floor of the Nexus. Beside it, in Harker's shaky handwriting, were the words, "The first marker." The realization hit me like a freight train. The notes I had bought were just the beginning. There were more markers out there, more objects tied to the future that needed to be found and destroyed. The Nexus had been a battleground, but the war was far from over. Determined to uncover the truth, I started my search for the other markers. I scoured the deep web, contacted every obscure collector and historian I could find, and delved into the darkest corners of the internet. The more I searched, the clearer it became. These markers were spread across the globe, hidden in places where the veil between our time and the future was thinnest. My first lead took me to a small village in Eastern Europe. According to an old legend, a strange artifact had been found in the village, a coin with a date that had not yet come to pass. The locals spoke of strange occurrences and vanished tourists, all linked to the mysterious coin. It sounded too familiar to ignore. I arrived in the village under the cover of night, hoping to avoid drawing too much attention. The air was cold, and the narrow streets were eerily quiet. Following the directions I had pieced together, I found myself standing in front of an old church, its doors hanging off their hinges. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. As I explored, I found a hidden compartment beneath the altar, containing a small ornate box. My hands trembled as I opened the box, revealing the coin inside. It was tarnished, but unmistakably strange. The date read 2050, and the design was unlike any currency I had ever seen. As I held the coin, a familiar chill ran down my spine. The shadows in the room seemed to move, and I heard the faintest whisper. With the coin in hand, I returned to my hotel room and began the ritual. This time, I was prepared. The locket, the obsidian, and the mirror were arranged carefully, and I began the incantation. The ground shook, and the room darkened, but I kept going. The shadows gathered around me, their whispers growing louder, but I didn't stop. As I finished the incantation, the shadows screamed and dissolved into nothingness. The coin disintegrated in my hand, leaving only a fine black dust. I collapsed, exhausted but triumphant. Another marker destroyed, another step closer to preventing the future I had seen. Over the next few months, I traveled to remote locations, each time finding and destroying a new marker. Each confrontation with the shadows grew more intense, the whispers more desperate. The markers were keys to a dark future, and the entities would do anything to protect them. The final marker led me to a deserted island in the Pacific. According to an ancient manuscript, a strange artifact had been buried there, one that held immense power. The journey was treacherous, the island itself a labyrinth of dense jungle and treacherous cliffs, but I pressed on, driven by the knowledge that this could be the end. I found the artifact buried deep within a cave, an old rusted key with a date etched into it, 2077. The moment I touched it, the air grew cold and the shadows began to gather. I had no time to prepare, no chance to think. The final confrontation had begun. The shadows were relentless, their forms more solid and terrifying than ever before. I could hear their whispers, their voices filled with anger and desperation. But I was ready. I placed the key on the ground, arranged the locket, the obsidian, and the mirror, and began the incantation. The ground trembled violently, and the shadows screamed, their forms flickering and dissolving. The air around me crackled with energy, and the key began to glow. I kept chanting, my voice growing louder, overpowering the whispers. With a final earth-shattering scream, the shadows exploded into nothingness. The key disintegrated, and the cave was plunged into silence. I collapsed, my body aching, and my mind exhausted. But it was over. The markers were destroyed, the future altered. I returned home, scarred but victorious. The shadows no longer haunted me, and the whispers had ceased. The future, depicted by the notes, had been prevented, at least for now. But I knew that darkness would always be a part of our world, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. As I put Dr. Harker's journal away, I couldn't help but wonder what other horrors lay hidden in the corners of time. But for now, I was at peace, knowing I had done everything I could to protect the present from the darkness of the future. And as I drifted off to sleep, I held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind me. But in the back of my mind, I knew that the battle between light and darkness was never truly over. The future was still out there, waiting to be written